Earlier this week, I found myself feeling kind of dragged down by the news, just in general. The news is not good. The world is messed up. I found myself thinking a lot about what's happening in Nigeria. Nigeria is a mess right now. It's one of the most violent countries you could be living in, especially if you're Christian. In the last couple of years alone, thousands of people have been abducted and kept for ransom. Some of them, many of them have survived that after being tortured, raped. Some of them have died in the process, sometimes even just being caught in the crossfire. It's a very scary place to be, especially for Christians in the northern part of Nigeria. Myanmar, Father Paul's own country, has been a mess for some time. 2 years ago, they held elections. The military decided they didn't like the results of the election, so there was a military coup. The military just took over. They executed 1,000 people to start, people who were in charge. And they've detained thousands more since. And it doesn't matter how much other countries are saying what they're doing is wrong, it's getting worse and worse. Father Paul is slightly encouraged by the fact that the people are beginning to kind of gather together. There's some resistance movement happening. There's going to be some sort of revolution. But while that's good news, because it needs to happen, it's also scary because people are going to die on both sides. Even in our own country, things are a mess. You can just watch the news for 2 minutes and see there's a lot of violence and sadness going on in our world. A few nights ago, I was just crushed. Just seeing how the vote went at the U.S. Senate about the Born Alive Act. This is a legislation that was proposed saying that children who are born alive after an attempted abortion should be given medical care, like any other child born at that age would be given medical care. Hospice care if necessary. Because the normal way that what they might call failed abortions, if a child is born alive, the normal way that is handled is that they are suffocated, strangled, or just exposed and waited until they die. So this legislation was to propose that the child born alive deserves medical care. And while the House, yes, passed it and recommends it towards the Senate, it's heartbreaking seeing that the representatives were split almost down the middle. All of those voting against it were from the same political party. How did this become a partisan issue? Whether or not an injured baby deserves medical care should not be a partisan issue. We live in a messy world right now. It is crushing. And so as I took it to prayer, I was slightly encouraged in prayer as the Lord was maybe reminding me of how messed up the world was when he was born into it. Even in the Roman Empire, you had corruption at the highest levels of the government there. You had religious persecution going on. For centuries in the Roman Empire, you had religious persecution. There was infanticide, the killing of infants. You had sexual sin just celebrated by the culture. It was messy, and it all sounds a whole lot like what we're going through right now, right? And while Jesus lived in the midst of that, it's fascinating to me that Jesus talked a lot about sin, but he never pointed at those political leaders as examples, right? He had a lot to say. He could have had a lot to say about the way that Caesar was corrupt in his own ways, the way that King Herod lived a really disgusting life. He could have talked about the corruption of Roman soldiers or the tax collectors. He did very little of, if any, of that. He didn't highlight those things. He didn't need to tell people about the bad news. They were already convinced of the bad news. Jesus came to give the good news. He comes to offer life. He comes to offer freedom and joy and peace and mercy. He came with this bright light in the midst of all that darkness. So whenever we're feeling dragged down by the darkness, we're supposed to remember that Jesus is the light in the midst of all of that. Jesus comes to scatter that darkness. And as I prayed with it, I was also drawn to this truth that ultimately Jesus did change the Roman Empire. He didn't do it, though, by changing systems or preaching about politics. He didn't do any of that. He did manage, though, to change the Roman Empire by converting one heart at a time. Look at his disciples who chose to live a life of holiness, and then as they spread the gospel and other people chose to live holiness personally, it changed the Roman Empire to the point that the Roman Empire within a few hundred years was Christian. It's fascinating. They went from religious persecution, from Christians being killed in the Colosseum to the Roman Empire being Christian. And it all was from one holy person impacting another person and making them holy. That second reading, St. Paul says that we have been, we've been sanctified by Jesus Christ, and we've been called to be holy. think sometimes we can get in our head that to be holy means that I have to pray with particular words in a particular posture. Like, I think we might sometimes have like this artificial idea of what holiness is supposed to look like. But ultimately, holiness just means that I'm letting my faith impact everything about my life. It impacts the way that I talk to other people, the words that I use. It impacts the things that I watch, the things that I read. It impacts the way that I vote, the way that I think. Am I willing to let Christ, am I willing to allow my faith to impact absolutely everything about me? If I am willing to let him do that, well, that's the beginning of holiness. In a way, maybe that's the entire journey of our Christian life, is giving the Lord more and more real estate in our heart, because the more that the Lord takes over our heart, the more that we become like him, the more that we love like him, the more that we just become holy. So today, maybe if we're feeling a little overwhelmed by the negative news in the world, and it is heavy, we just place it in the Lord's mercy. We beg for the Lord to be the light in the midst of that darkness. And we ask Jesus to dwell in our hearts, because we've been sanctified by Jesus Christ, and we've been called to be holy.